Hi, I am Robert Poirier, and you are listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
It's our Christmas show. Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. One of the biggest controversies in history concerns a building in Washington, D.C., the Watergate. Ever since the 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters in that building, the word Watergate has become synonymous with political scandal. If you are under 40, it's likely a vague term that your parents talked about in the 1970s, either complaining about how Nixon was railroaded or how he should have been kicked out sooner. Today, we learn about Watergate, both the scandal and the building, with author Joe Rodota. And now, your host of one of the top 10 architecture podcasts, because there are only 11, George Smart.
Hi, folks. Yes, I'm glad to say that US Modernist Radio consistently rocks the top 10 of 11. And on this special day, I'm grateful to all our fans for the huge support we get from you every day, all year. You all write and email and Instagram and Facebook and sometimes call, and I love it. Thank you. Creating these shows for you, our 34 listeners, is an incredible gift to me and Tom 365 days a year, and we'll make more. Email your ideas about topics and guests to george@usmodernist.org. Today is December 24th, and in what has become a Yuletide tradition, where tradition equals 2 consecutive years in a row, I'm so happy to have Raleigh architect Aaron Sterling Lewis on during our Christmas show, this time as co-host. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, George.
I hear that you got a big National Architecture Award this year.
Oh, gosh. Are you going to make me talk about it?
Yes. But first, let's hear more about you. Aaron Sterling Lewis is one of my favorite architects. She is a partner in the firm In Situ Studio with Matt Griffith in Raleigh, North Carolina. That firm has won at least a dozen state and local AIA awards, plus, was it 4 George Matsumoto prizes?
Yes.
And their work has appeared many times in Dwell, Architizer, and other design publications. She is past president of AIA North Carolina and has worked with NC Modernist on our high school outreach program, Project Bauhaus. And she just won the
2018 Young Architects Award,
which is a very big deal. The award honors individuals who have demonstrated exceptional leadership, maybe I should lower my voice, exceptional leadership, and made significant contributions to the architecture profession early in their careers. Did you win anything, Aaron, like electric car or a trip to study Bjarke Ingels or espresso machine, anything?
Wouldn't that be nice? I was hoping for a trophy. You know, I haven't gotten a trophy since I played softball as a kid, but no trophy. I would say 2 things that you may say I won. I did receive an unexpected check in the mail, which was not advertised. So that was a surprise. That was a treat. And then the other thing I would say I won, so to speak, from it is that by my honor of this award has elevated awareness of it for other young architects in the state. And this year we had numerous people in the state and the region apply for it who I don't think maybe knew about it before that. So I'm anxious to see who in our community is going to receive an award for next year. It's really exciting.
Well, we all know architects drink a lot of coffee, and if the AIA gave away espresso machines with awards, they would revolutionize design submissions. I mean, who doesn't like a latte in their office? Bob Ivey, are you listening? Head of the AIA? It's time for you to work a deal with Miele or Nespresso or even Starbucks, okay? All right, moving on. This is our very first show without engineer and announcer Tom Guild. Tom and his girlfriend are having a wonderful vacation somewhere in Canada. Oh, Canada. They are riding the Via train from Vancouver to Toronto or maybe vice versa. It's one of the most beautiful train journeys in the world, something on a lot of people's bucket lists, including mine. So in the studio, on the boards today, we have Cameron. Thank you, Cameron. So, Aaron, would you do the honors with today's sponsor?
Sure. Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Realtor Angela Rowell. In an adventure we're completely making up, Realtor Angela Rowell grew up in Switzerland, soaking in Peter Zumthor's spa at Vals by night while her parents fixed her up with Corbusier's little-known grandson, French basketball player Pierre Stilts Corbusier.
Mon Dieu!
Like his grandfather, Stilts liked to keep everything up in the air, including their romance. So when she caught him in Paris with Frank Lloyd Wright's little-known great-granddaughter, Brittany Lloyd Wright...
Oops, she did it again.
It was time to move to America. Hatching a brilliant plan involving a little red dress, a wood-turning lathe, a case of Cristal, and the entire senior faculty of the Architectural Association of London, Angela got admitted to the North Carolina State University in North Carolina, where she studied architecture by day and flipped houses by night. After a speech at the school by famous developer Marvin Gardens, she decided to use her architectural training to specialize in modernist real estate, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to where to buy an Eames chair. Angela Rowell is your special agent. Reach her at angelarowell.com, that's ROEHL, or at 919-995-0550.
Dun-dun-dun. Watergate. It's come to mean scandal, usually but not always political scandal. The gate part is used as a suffix for other scandals in everything from sports to entertainment to media. Our guest today is Joe Rodota, author of The Watergate, a history of the iconic Washington, D.C. building and some of its most famous residents. Joe has served as a writer and communications manager in the Reagan White House and also as an aide to both California governors Pete Wilson and Arnold Schwarzenegger. He has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Huffington Post, and other publications. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Joe, before we get to talking about Watergate, I want to ask about one of your earlier projects. Do you know what I'm going to ask you about?
No.
Do you have any kind of psychic stirrings that come up?
Yeah. Gene Dixon, is that what you're asking about?
It's amazing. How did you get that?
I had a premonition. Yes, I'm the author of a new play, which recently was staged by B Street Theater in Sacramento. It's called The Gene Dixon Effect, and it is a one-woman show, the story of America's favorite celebrity clairvoyant, the psychic Gene Dixon.
Now, Gene Dixon is kind of old school. She hasn't been around for, 20 years?
In spirit, she's with us today, but she passed away in 1997. Yes, and the play follows her from her early days as a housewife and wannabe actress in Southern California to the Oval Office, actually, where she actually talked herself into the Oval Office and met with Richard Nixon.
Wow, how did she do that?
Well, she was friends with Rose Mary Woods, the famous confidential secretary to Richard Nixon. She did readings for Rose, and that's how I stumbled across the story, because Rose Mary Woods was one of the more famous residents of the Watergate. And so in the middle of that crisis, I mean, if you imagine, Rose had dedicated her entire life to Richard Nixon. She was known as the fifth Nixon, the four being the four members of the family. And under incredible personal stress as she's watching her boss's presidency implode, she was consulting the famous Washington psychic, Gene Dixon, who sort of the advisor to many people in Washington, and also had a pretty good client list in Hollywood.
Now, I Googled the phrase Gene Dixon effect and found this. John Allen Paulos, a mathematician at Temple, coined this term, which references the tendency to promote a few correct predictions while ignoring a larger number of incorrect predictions. What was her track record over time? Was it good? Was it not so good?
Well, I have on my desk a pile of stars, the tabloid newspaper Star, which would have Gene Dixon's predictions for the coming year, and there would always be like 4 or 5 pages of them covering every Hollywood stars and the cast of Dallas, and there's even a smattering of Maria Shriver, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Donald Trump throughout. And there'd be 1 or 2 boxes over 5 pages that said that last year Gene had successfully predicted X or Y. So that might be the ratio. But John Allen Paulus, one of the first sort of popular mathematicians, kind of an early Freakonomics type of mathematician, wrote a great book looking at all sorts of mathematical phenomenon and took on Gene Dixon and parapsychology. It was really pretty interesting, and I worked that. That's the inspiration for the title of the show, is his phrase.
Now, do you cover what her last words were when she died?
Yeah, no spoilers, George. No spoilers.
Okay.
Yeah. Everybody wants to know the last words of it. What was the dying words of a psychic? And,
I mean, it was on the internet. I won't say it, but it was. People can look this up right now, Joe.
Okay. Well, so her last words allegedly were, "I knew this would happen."
Oh.
Uh-huh.
Which I think we can all predict. I think we can all predict.
Yeah, I got that.
I forget which celebrity says, I think on his tombstone, it said, "I told you I wasn't feeling very well."
Yes.
Now, I also read, this might be National Star material as well, that her cat was psychic too?
Yes. I'm staring at a painting of him right now in my office. His name was Mike, and he was psychic. He would conduct readings. She would take him to events, and people would pet the cat. The cat would take in the full measure of the individual and give a message to Gene, and then Gene would relay the message to the recipient. And Mike, I think at one point, had his own secretary. I encountered all this when I found an auction catalog for the Gene Dixon estate, which was auctioned by Sloane's and Kenyon in Washington a few years after her death. And there was a whole section of Mike the Magic Cat memorabilia, and just fascinating. People would make paintings of him and send them to her as gifts, and she kept them. I wish I had an original. I just have a copy.
When did Mike pass away?
Unclear. I don't think she saw that coming. He became famous because he disappeared. She lost the cat. She said psychically she was in communication with him, but she didn't know where he was. And he turned up at the White House. And a friend of hers was a reporter and wrote the story of the cat, that Gene Dixon's famous cat, showing up at the White House. And then off they went, and he became a celebrity.
It seems like access to the White House a little bit easier in those days.
Yeah, well, the cats could wander in and be taken in. Exactly. Yeah.
Right now, I think if a cat wandered in, there'd be a chopper landing on the South Lawn to take it out.
Yeah, the electronics are quite sensitive. I think they would pick up a cat these days. Yes. Yeah. So that's a great story, and that's it's a Watergate spinoff. So we'll see what happes.
Well, while psychic cats is one of my favorite things to talk about on the planet, we do need to get on. So Joe, tell me, how'd you get started in politics?
I was when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. My thing was history. I was a history major at Stanford, and I had a job at a think tank on campus, and I was just sort of contemplating going directly to law school or finding taking a break and working. And some of my bosses at this think tank called the Hoover Institution said, "Why don't you try Washington?" And I thought it was good as an idea as any, and so I went to Washington. Had about a 4-year run, ending up in the Reagan White House. I arrived with beat up suitcases and a one-way ticket, and within 2 or 3 years was on the campaign and had a corner office in the old executive office building. It was really, really exciting, great opportunity. And I remember in that era coming into Washington for the first time with my boss, who was a staff member for a member of Congress, my local member, and seeing the Watergate for the first time. And I think everybody has that experience when you cross the Potomac, if that's the route you take, and you see this huge building, and it's larger than people expect, and it's in color. People are mostly used to seeing the Watergate in black and white, and of course it has this incredible history, and it stuck with me. And when I returned to Washington 30 or so years later, I got the idea for writing the story of the building.
Well, now wait a second. This sounds a little bit like a singer-songwriter tale of moving to Nashville with no money on a one-way ticket, and all of a sudden, like 4 years later, playing at the Grand Ole Opry. I mean, how did you make that transition to working in the Reagan White House?
Well, I'll credit my history professors at Stanford. So I was known as I was a good writer, but I was a fast writer. I could produce a lot of material very quickly. And I always had sort of interesting jobs with good groups that had sort of a research, rapid response kind of responsibility. So in '84, I got tapped to go over to the Republican National Committee to join the Republican Committee, the committee's opposition research group. So I became one of the youngest scholars in the life of Walter Mondale.
Oh, boy.
So we were all unauthorized biographers. It's one way to think of us.
Now, did you come up with that quip about refusing to make Walter's youth and indiscretion an issue, something like that?
No, but I was on the staff at the time, and we did get a little bit of the backstory with Roger Ailes, the late chairman of Fox News, who was brought in to try to rescue the debate, the second debate for Reagan, help him through the debate prep. And he had apparently taken the president aside and said, "You're gonna get a question about your age," and that gave Reagan. Reagan said, "I think I've got an answer." So nobody's ever taken credit for that answer other than Ronald Reagan. He was a pretty shrewd person, and he also had a very good self-deprecating sense of humor. So I figure if somebody else would have come up with that line, we would have heard it by now in some tell-all, attention-grabbing memoir. But so far, no one.
But that was that era for the re-election.
Right. 84. Yeah.
84, yeah. Okay.
Our team, which was the Mondale team, we worked for a guy named David Stockman, and he was...
Oh, the OMB guy.
Yeah, and so he was also from Minnesota, and so I think it was Jim Baker asked him to be Walter Mondale in debate prep. And so one of my colleagues and I, we just went over and over and over with him, helping him become Walter, which was fascinating.
So you did essentially kind of a dress rehearsal. With David Stockman playing Walter Mondale.
Right, and a woman named Lynn Martin later played Geraldine Ferraro for the mock debates for the vice president.
Now, was it before that or after that you began working for California governors?
So I'm originally a Californian. I'm from just north of the Bay Area, a town called Santa Rosa. And so 6 years in Washington. I moved back here in '88, worked on George H.W. Bush's campaign in California, and set up a research and writing shop here. And so I was in California pretty much full time since '88, with a couple of breaks, but mostly California.
So were you working for the governors in an official capacity or just as a consultant?
Both. I was a Dianne Feinstein biographer for Pete Wilson when he ran against Dianne Feinstein in 1990 for governor of California. Pete Wilson, a former senator, was looking to come back to Sacramento and run for governor. I got to know him very well, and about 2 years into his administration, he asked me to close my firm and come work for him internally full-time, which I did for the entire administration. I was cabinet secretary, which is roughly equivalent to chief operating officer. Then went back into private sector after that. And
when did Governor Arnold come along?
Arnold Schwarzenegger. I got this call from, done some work for Arnold. Pete Wilson had called me and said he had a friend of his who was thinking of running for governor. Would I spend some time with him? And I said, sure. And who is it? And it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. And this was about 3 years before the recall. And I actually put together Arnold's history and for internal use of what his political history was, where he had taken a stand in public on every issue. Wrote a book called Arnold A to Z, which was sort of like the platform. for where he was up to that point. It turned out he was an interesting man. He is very, very well read. He's an autodidact, a voracious reader, and he'd actually been over the years interested in public policy, and he had formed some thoughts, and it was on the record in some interesting ways. And then he decided not to run. And then when the recall popped, of course, he famously announced he was running for governor on the Jay Leno show, and within a few hours, I got a call, and I returned to Santa Monica and set up shop. So I was the director of policy for his recall. And it was really nothing like, I've never seen anything like it. It's really quite amazing.
Well, as I recall, Schwarzenegger was kind of a moderate Republican compared to the more conservative ones today.
Right. He considered himself very progressive on environment and social issues, and very fiscally conservative. And he's similar to Wilson in many ways. And so he's sort of this peculiar twist on the Republican brand, really sort of defined the California Republican. And also he's sort of an outsider, one of the first celebrity outsiders. He and Reagan had more of a political background than Arnold did, possibly going into the office. But both of them citizen politicians. And
this was about the time Jesse Ventura, the wrestler, was getting to be governor?
Right. And so we're trying not to fall into that mold, because Ventura's governorship wasn't particularly successful. But Arnold, he's one of the most famous people in the world, and it was just extraordinary. Anybody who you wanted to talk to would talk to him. Like, so Warren Buffett he'd pick up the phone. He could call Warren Buffett. He could call the head of any organization in the world. We had some of the best advisors pro bono from both parties you can imagine.
Did Arnold do anything significant architecturally during his administration, like any great buildings he kicked off and got going?
No, I don't think so. I can't recall anything. He at one point tried to sell all the most valuable state buildings and then use the money to close the deficit and then lease them back. And it turned out to be not much of a deal, and so that crumbled. But I think that's the only thing I can think of.
Well, let's talk about the Watergate. I was surprised to learn that this building, at least the thought of it, had been around quite a while. It actually started the design in the late 50s. Is that right?
Right. So the team that built, the architectural firm that built the Rockefeller Center in New York was actually hired by a group of Washingtonians and some New Yorkers who had an option on the land. And I've seen the drawings for what would have been, I think, call it Potomac Center or something like that. And it looked like Rockefeller Plaza on the water in Washington, D.C. It also had a skating rink, and had a marina and everything. And they were unable to get financing for that project. And then an Italian firm, became aware of the land and the option that was expiring, and bought the option and bought the land from the coal company, the local gas light company that had used the land for many, many years as an industrial park to turn coal into gas. But the first attempts to make that into a development predate the current building.
So who was the architect?
So the architect was a guy named Luigi Moretti, Moretti. He, a young Italian architect, he's very, very Roman. People described him as he was like quintessentially Roman. He would enter a restaurant as if he were a Renaissance prince, and he would drive around Italy in the era of La Dolce Vita. He'd be driven around in a chauffeur-driven convertible, and just this bigger-than-life personality. And he had started before the war. He was one of the architects Mussolini tapped to help reimagine Rome. He was very involved in the design of the Olympic Village, what would have become the Olympic Village before the war. It was originally named Foro Mussolini. It's now known as Foro Italico. And he was closely aligned with the fascist government, was jailed briefly after the war, and then was released under a general amnesty and started his own architectural practice based in Rome, and completed some amazing buildings throughout Rome and some spectacular villas all over the Mediterranean. And when the company, which was called Società Generale Immobiliare, SGI, we'll say for your listeners, got the land, they turned to him and asked him to design the project, and he considered it not a typical architectural commission. He thought it was actually an opportunity to show the world Italian genius and creativity. And so one of the first surprises for me in working on the book was how Italian the building is. I really sort of thought of it as, must be just it's a local product. It's associated with an American scandal. But at its core, financially and also in terms of design, it's an Italian building.
So in addition to maybe the style being a bit unusual, is it an unusual building for Washington, D.C., and maybe its use, at least at that time? It's multi-use?
Yeah, it was a break-the-mold building. So for the region, it's the first multi-use development. So I call it the Watergate, but really the Watergate is a lot of things. It's 10 acres. It's actually 6 different buildings, 3 co-op apartment buildings.
Yeah, that's a big surprise.
Buildings.
I always thought it was just one hotel building.
Yeah, people think it's a hotel. So it's the hotel, 2 offices, 3 apartments, plus an arcade, a shopping arcade, all built on top of an underground parking lot that held 1,200 cars. And it was designed. It was originally described in its marketing material as a city within the city. And one way to think about this moment is this is like 1963, 64, and cities weren't as attractive then as they are now. People thought cities were old and tired, possibly dangerous, and certainly not modern. And so people were moving away. They were moving to the suburbs. If you moved to the suburbs, you would have a cool new house. Your post office would be new. Your school would be new. Your shopping center would be new. And that was where modern life was. And so this was designed to pull people back from the suburbs, back into the city, and give the resident all the convenience of a modern suburban life, but right inside the city. So something was stylish, convenient, and secure. And so that's why it was essential that this place had a restaurant on the campus. You could go to meetings, you have an office there. You could go to the liquor store, get your hair done, go to the post office, the bank. They even had psychiatrists and dentists. So it was really marketed as a city within a city. And it was also marketed toward women. There were, at this era, was where you're starting to see women move from secretarial positions to management positions, and there were very few options for a single professional woman to own as opposed to rent in a city. And so this building had a lot of young women as initial residents, including Elizabeth Dole, who later became Secretary of Transportation, Labor, etc. She was one of the original residents when she was a young White House aide.
Well, that's nice to know. That's good forward thinking.
Good North Carolina citizen, Libby
Yes,
Dole.
North Carolina.
love
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Yeah,
This is all good. Well, Joe, you mentioned earlier a little bit about the history of the site, but how did the project get the name Watergate?
Well, there's several mysteries around the Watergate era, right? And this is one of them. I found 3 different versions for how the name came to be attached to the place. One version is that Warren Adler, who is a famous novelist and playwright and author of the book that became the War of the Roses, he was at the time a publicist working for local developers in Washington. And he told me he came up with the name and was inspired by the Watergate Barge, which was like a outside concert hall that floated near the Lincoln Memorial, and the National Symphony Orchestra for many years performed their summer concerts there. And then I talked to a man named Giuseppe Cecchi, who came out from Italy in his 20s to work on the project, and he said that he just kind of shrugged. He's in his 90s now, and he said, well, the name was obvious. I mean, the water was right there. And then I got from the family of a guy named Nicholas Salgo, I got the unpublished memoir of their father, and he said that he had acquired the name in a business transaction from a woman named Marjorie Hendricks, who owned the Watergate Inn, which was this Pennsylvania Dutch sort of restaurant on what is the land, on a corner of the land that is now underneath the Kennedy Center. And she had actually hired an architect to draw up plans. So she was planning to tear down her building, and which was an old riding academy, and erect a 7-story apartment building with a restaurant on the ground floor. And I found the drawings for that in the Library of Congress. And she was going to name the building Watergate, and the drawings actually have the word Watergate across the top. So that was about 1959. And so she might be the original individual who came up with the name.
Now, the first building was opened in 1967. How did people like it? How was it received by Washingtonians, those inside the Beltway bandits?
Well, I would say it was not for everybody. It was big and modern and daring, and I also came to think of Watergate as sort of part, it was like a freshman dorm of Washington. It was part pressure cooker, part fishbowl. So you were in a building, you could sort of see your neighbors, and you knew you'd be part of this sort of almost like you're on a cruise ship, but you can see everybody who's around you. And it attracted a very, what I would consider sort of avant-garde, kind of international group of residents. Right off the bat, you had people who were downsizing from the suburbs. We had people who were very progressive on racial matters, who did not want to live in Northern Virginia anymore because one person in an interview had said that they couldn't have their African-American friends over for the weekend because the pool was segregated in their community. And so you got this sort of mix of very wealthy people buying penthouses, including the family behind the Mars Candy Empire, bought one of the big penthouses at one end of Watergate East, and the other end was purchased by a woman who turned out to be very famous. Her name was Anna Chenault, and she bought a massive penthouse at the other end of the building and decorated it internally as if it was a Taiwanese Chinese museum. It's really fascinating. So you had penthouses at the top. There was sort of a double row of duplexes in the middle, and then you had 2-story townhouses on the ground floor. And then between you had a mix of apartments, including junior one-bedrooms. So it was sort of a mix of people at all levels of the economic spectrum, but you had to have a little bit of guts, I think, to move into the Watergate. It was pretty daring.
As we said earlier, the Watergate is not just one building, it's several, and one of those was an office building. So let's get to the famous burglary in 1972. What happened?
So it was actually the third successful attempt to get into the Democratic National Committee offices. So the 6th floor of the Watergate office building on Virginia Avenue was occupied by the Democratic National Committee. And the burglars were based in 2 suites in the hotel, 214 and 314. And so the plan was they would take the elevators down to the basement, cross through a connecting underground parking lot, and then go up into the suite. And I interviewed a guy, the last person to leave the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee that night. His name was Bruce Givner, and he's now in his 60s. He's a lawyer. And at the time, he was a 21-year-old intern from UCLA. And what he was doing that night, this is Friday, June 16th, 1972, is he was using the free telephone line. They were calling it a Watts line.
Oh, the Watts line. I remember them.
Yeah. So there was a Watts line in one of the offices, and our Spencer Oliver's office. And Bruce was on the phone calling all of his friends and family, but back in Lorain, Ohio. And he said he only took one break for making his calls, and that was to go out onto the terrace and take a leak into one of the potted plants. And then he went back in and made some more phone calls. And then he did not know until later that he was being observed the entire time from the Howard Johnsons across the way. So the reason that the entry into the Watergate suite was delayed was because Bruce was using the free telephone line.
So let me see if I have this right.
It's a great interview.
So we have some burglars going through the basement and some in the Howard Johnsons?
Yeah, there's an observation post across the way, and the guy across the way, Alfred Baldwin, is using a radio to call back to Gordon Liddy and telling him that the office was still being occupied.
Okay.
And I interviewed 2 of the 3 arresting officers are still alive, and I interviewed them both. And they didn't really have a sense they were going into a political office at all. At the time, there had been a rash of thefts in offices of IBM, of the new IBM Selectric typewriter. There was a rash. There was a lot of typewriter theft going on.
Oh yeah, they were very expensive and highly technological at the day.
Yeah, so they were on the Vice. There was a team that was undercover, wearing hippie vests and what have you, and almost a Vice kind of squad.
Serpico, yeah.
They got the call, and they were undercover, and so then when they arrive at the building, and they go up with Frank Wills, the famous guard, and they discover these 4 or 5 men in suits, and it was only when they looked around after everybody had their hands up they realized they were in offices of the Democratic National Committee. And what was fun about this, so I didn't try to in the book to excavate everything everybody already knew about Watergate. I actually looked at the whole book, in fact, as if I put myself in an apartment at the Watergate. So the perspective for the reader is you bought a junior one-bedroom apartment in 1965 in the first building, so you just sort of follow what happens around you. And so it was interesting to talk to people about how the burglary and the notoriety affect them. At this moment, a building that is known for an address that is known for 2 things, luxury and privacy, is now known for one thing, which is scandal. And one of the immediate effects was on the hotel. And within days of the break-in, the guests at the Watergate Hotel started stealing anything that had Watergate written on it. And they were losing towels at the rate of $4,000 a month. And in one of the interviews I had with a former manager, he said, well, we had to go with anonymous towels because anything that had Watergate on it would be taken.
I remember that, I think in the mid-'70s, maybe late 70s, the Watergate replaced all its carpet. And some entrepreneur bought it all and cut it up into 1-inch squares and sold it as souvenirs. Little tiny 1-inch squares of Watergate carpet.
Genius.
Oh, yeah, and I interviewed the firm that liquidated the hotel many, many years later, and people lined up for hours to get in and buy just a piece of that history. I also interviewed a guy named David Bradley, who went on to create 2 huge companies out of his mother's Watergate second bedroom. And he was sort of hanging out after deciding not to finish law school, and he wanted to try to talk the management out of selling him one of the Watergate doors, one of the doors that had been taped by the burglars, and he was planning to cut that into little cubes, and they wouldn't sell it to him. And then I think that door might have ended up at the museum in downtown Washington.
Did any of the Watergate end up at the Smithsonian?
Well, there is Watergate material, but actually I don't really know offhand. No, I saw it at the museum for sure.
Well, the property has attracted tons of famous people over the years. Tell us about some of those.
Well, you had the Nixon crowd, which was sort of interesting. You had John and Martha Mitchell, Martha Mitchell was one of the most famous people of her day. She was on Laugh-In. She was on the cover of every newspaper, this plain-speaking, somewhat boozy Arkansas gal. And John Mitchell was Nixon's attorney general and later a campaign manager who resigns right around the Watergate break-in. And then you also had Pat Buchanan, who's Nixon's young speechwriter, married Shelley Buchanan, and she lived at the Watergate. One of the earlier residents was Bob Dole. And Bob moved into a building called Watergate South in around 1972. It ended up being on the vice presidential nominee on the ticket with Gerald Ford. For a time, he was, for the 1972 Nixon campaign, he was the chairman of the Republican National Committee.
Was he already married to Liddy by then?
No, he got married to her later. Their first date, though, was at the Watergate Hotel. She lived in Watergate East, and he asked her out. And he didn't propose to her until he got reelected in 1974, which was a very, very tough year for Republicans. And he was worried he would be unemployed, so he didn't ask her to marry him until he survived his race. During the Watergate scandal, one of their neighbors, briefly, was Ben Bradley, the famous editor of the Washington Post.
Who wrote about the Watergate scandal.
Yeah. So he's covering the Watergate scandal, and Sally Quinn, who became his wife, they lived together, and they would run into the Nixon crowd, including Bob Dole and other Nixon aides like Victor Lasky. They would run into each other in the elevators at the height of Watergate. That's what I thought was really pretty interesting. Bob Dole and Elizabeth Dole's next-door neighbor was a young woman named Monica Lewinsky.
Have you ever heard of her? I don't know.
That?
Who's that again? Who's that?
Yeah, exactly. Marsha Lewis, Monica's mother, rented a two-story ground floor apartment in Watergate South, right next door to the Doles. And when it was revealed in the media that she had had an affair with Bill Clinton, who was Bob Dole's opponent in 1996, he had two reactions. One was, where was Gordon Liddy when I needed him? And the other was, if I knocked out that wall and absorbed that apartment into mine, it really open up my whole living room. And so it just sort of illustrated to me that the Watergate was like every other building in America, which is people are constantly imagining what it'd be like if their pesky neighbor somehow went away and they could be absorbed into their real estate. And that's in fact what the Doles did, is they bought the apartment when Lewinsky moved out and remodeled, and when Bob would give tours of the apartment, he would point to one end of the living room and he would introduce it as Monica Land. And another neighbor on the same floor is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She and her husband lived in Watergate South, and she lives there still.
Does Condoleezza Rice still live there?
Secretary Rice lived there during the Bush administration, so she's back in California now. She had a big apartment with room enough for her piano, and she's a concert pianist. She had put together a small orchestra, and people would come over, and they would just play music for hours and hours in the apartment. And I found an interview of somebody who was able to sit in on one of those sessions, which was great. And I interviewed Karl Rove, Bush's famous advisor, who told me about what Condoleezza Rice's Christmas parties were like. They were A-list guests, some of the best music you can imagine, and terrible hors d'oeuvres.
What did she serve?
Triscuits and cheddar cheese, pretty much.
Huh. That's a delicacy in some parts where I'm from, but
sounds good to me.
So over the years, probably less so now, but it was a place where different administrations would sort of sweep through, and you'd have sort of the eras of the Watergate would correspond roughly to the eras of the administration. So you had a Bush crowd, to a little extent you had a Carter crowd, and you had a very big Reagan crowd. When the recovery of the Watergate really begins, the post-break-in recovery begins in 1981, when all of Nancy Reagan's friends and their husbands move into the Watergate. And so the first year of the Reagan administration, the Watergate just takes off. It's now filled with Hollywood, Southern California money. And Mrs. Reagan was over there constantly having lunch. She and her girlfriends referred to themselves simply as the group. They actually, going into the 1980 election, the hotel staff had two budgets, one for Carter's reelection and one for Reagan's election. And the Reagan budget was much, much higher.
Oh, I'm sure.
And at one point, the general manager of the hotel just sighed and said, we're no longer the Nixon Watergate. It was also home at one point to possibly the best restaurant in America. It was called Jean-Louis, and it was a restaurant started by the youngest two-star chef in France. And he was recruited to the Watergate by a new owner and said the only way we're going to be able to turn this thing around is to invest, and we need the best restaurant in the country. And he, in this little basement, the former cubbyhole of the Democratic National Club, built a restaurant that people would just clamor to get to. Very, very small and very, very, very elite dining spot. And people who dine there to this day remember the meals.
Well, Joe, today, can people stay at the Watergate Hotel? Is there still a hotel component and a great restaurant in there someplace?
Yes, the hotel came back to life. It was closed for about 10 years. There was a plan at one point to convert the hotel into apartments. That plan was an early casualty of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which had been providing financing for the renovation. And it was pretty much closed throughout the Great Recession. Reopened a couple of years ago. Of a young couple in the hotel business, who works in the family businesses, Canada, U.S., and Europe. They bought and renovated the Watergate Hotel. And they did two things that I think are really terrific. One is they really invested in the interior of the hotel and made it as high design and as unusual and as exciting as the exterior. I have brochures from the original hotel, which opened in 1967, and the interiors are very, very plain. They look like middle American, almost a Holiday Inn. And I found in the archives in Rome of the company a letter where the owner of the Watergate, the head of the company, described the interior design as just atrocious. But the new design is very modern. It was overseen by a good team of people. I think it's Ron Arad was the principal designer for it. So it's very high style. And then the second thing they did is they didn't shy away from the scandal. They actually leaned into it. And so when you stay there and you're on hold waiting for the front desk to pick up, you don't hear music. You hear tapes of Richard Nixon's Oval Office addresses.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, it's great. And then they have the keys say no need to break in, and they just have fun with it. And they have a great restaurant, a great bar program, and and they opened up the roof for the first time. Even though it's the Watergate originally was designed, the hotel had no roof terrace that was open to the public. All you had were private terraces that were mostly sold to the penthouses. And so for the first time, you can go up on top of the hotel. And in the winters, they put a ice skating rink on the top of the hotel. And the place is packed, and it's very youthful, and it's a great place to stay. I've stayed there, and it's really a wonderful location again. And it's getting its second life, and that it's great to see. It's really great to see.
Well, Joe, this has been great. Thanks so much for joining us and telling us about the history of the building, not just scandal.
Well, it's a great opportunity. I think for me, it was a great experience. I'm not an architectural historian by any means.
Funny, I'm not either.
But and I had this sort of probably this same view most people. I had sort of a familiarity with the building mostly through what happened in the 70s. And so what I try to do with the book is write a biography of a building. So if you look at the Watergate as a person, it's now in middle age. And it seemed unfair to simply think of it only for what had happened during its awkward teenage years. And so the story goes from conception to the present, and turned out to be a series of very interesting stories, not only about architects, and the permitting process turned out to be very dramatic, and the construction turned out to be interesting. And then also, when you start filling a building like that with people, in a pressure cooker environment, it can get kind of exciting. The Washington Post, about 1971, did a big story on the Watergate and referred to it as a glittering Potomac Titanic. And they meant that as a compliment because it was like this ocean liner filled with, the A-list of Washington. And they said there only one difference between the Watergate and the doomed ocean liner was there was no iceberg ahead. And of course, there was an iceberg about a year out.
Quite prophetic.
Quite prophetic. Nobody could foresee. And it's a great address and a series of great stories. And I'm really delighted you're interested in it.
Well, Joe, thanks again. The book is The Watergate, by Joe Rodota, available online or in your favorite local bookstore. Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special agent for Modernist Houses, 919-995-0550. Okay, take us out, Aaron.
Visit USModernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover 7,000 classic modernist houses, and access 2.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Chief of Guest Research, Cindy Stratton, not her real name, has fled to Mexico for the holidays and wishes you Feliz Navidad. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Triangle Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational organization for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Erin Sterling Lewis, and despite my better judgment, I'll be back with George in about 3 weeks with another edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Happy holidays!